Episode 16, titled Model Comparison Criteria, AIC, BIC, and Parsimony Without Hand-Waving, the goal is to compare models fairly when accuracy alone misleads, because DataX scenarios often include situations where two models look similar on headline performance but differ dramatically in complexity and operational risk. In real work, it is easy to fall in love with a slightly better metric and ignore the hidden costs that arrive later, such as brittle behavior, harder maintenance, and governance headaches. Information criteria like AIC and BIC exist to formalize the idea that fit is not free and that extra parameters should earn their keep. The exam rewards you when you can explain why a simpler model can be the better choice. Not because simplicity is fashionable, but because it reduces overfitting risk and improves reliability under change. This episode will make these criteria feel like practical decision tools rather than abstract formulas, and it will help you defend a model choice without hand-waving. When you can explain what AIC and BIC reward and what they penalize, you will be able to answer comparison questions with confidence. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the DataX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. AIC, which stands for AIC Information Criterion, is best understood as a measure of fit with a penalty for complexity. The core intuition is that a model should explain the observed data well, but it should not do so by piling on parameters that merely memorize noise. AIC uses a likelihood-based measure of fit and then adds a penalty term that grows with the number of parameters, meaning complexity increases the score unless it is justified by better fit. The exam does not typically require you to compute AIC, but it does expect you to interpret it correctly and to know that lower values are preferred because they represent a better trade between fit and complexity. When a scenario presents two models with similar predictive performance but different complexity, AIC gives you a principled way to lean toward the model that generalizes better. A common distractor is to treat AIC like a direct measure of accuracy, but it is not accuracy. It is a trade metric that balances explanation against parameter count. DataX rewards the learner who can state that trade clearly and use it to justify a choice. BIC, which stands for Bayesian Information Criterion, is similar in spirit but applies a stronger penalty as sample size grows, which makes it more conservative about adding parameters. Like AIC, BIC uses likelihood-based fit and then penalizes complexity. But the penalty increases with the logarithm of the sample size, meaning that in larger datasets, the cost of extra parameters becomes more severe. The practical consequence is that BIC tends to favor simpler models more strongly than AIC, especially when the dataset is large and many parameters could be added. On the exam, the key is not the formula detail, but the intuition that BIC is harsher on complexity, and therefore more aggressive about parsimony when evidence is not strong. A distractor may suggest that BIC is always better or always worse than AIC, but the correct reasoning is that they reflect different preferences about the trade between fit and simplicity. DataX rewards understanding that both criteria are tools and that the choice of criterion reflects the decision stance you want to take. When you can explain BIC as stronger penalty with larger samples, you are using the concept correctly. The reason complexity penalties matter is that they discourage overfitting and fragile models, which is the practical problem hiding behind many model comparison questions. Overfitting happens when a model fits not only the signal, but also the noise in the training data, producing performance that looks strong in development but collapses in new conditions. Extra parameters can increase flexibility, but flexibility is not automatically value. It is often a pathway to learning artifacts that do not generalize. Fragility appears when small changes in input distribution, data collection, or operational conditions cause the model to behave unpredictably, and more complex models can be harder to debug and harder to trust when that happens. The exam rewards the learner who sees complexity as a risk factor, not merely as a capability, because DataX is testing professional judgment about model reliability. Penalties in AIC and BIC are formal reminders that complexity must be earned by meaningful improvement in fit, not by marginal gains that could be noise. When you treat complexity penalties as a safeguard against being fooled by your own training data, you are thinking like a responsible practitioner. AIC and BIC are most appropriate when likelihood-based models apply, which is an important constraint because these criteria are not universal for every modeling situation. Likelihood-based models include many classical statistical models where a likelihood function is well-defined and comparable across candidate models. The exam may not require you to list specific model families, but it may ask when AIC and BIC are appropriate, and the correct answer emphasizes that they are used in contexts where likelihood comparison makes sense. A common error is to apply AIC and BIC to models or evaluation setups where likelihood is not being used in a comparable way, which undermines the validity of the comparison. DataX rewards learners who know that these criteria are not just generic model scores, but criteria tied to a specific evaluation framework. When you see a scenario emphasizing likelihood-based fitting and model selection, AIC and BIC should feel like natural tools. When you see a scenario emphasizing classification thresholds, confusion matrices, or non-likelihood metrics, AIC and BIC may not be the right lens. Fair comparison also requires that models be trained on the same dataset, because AIC and BIC comparisons assume that you are evaluating candidates under the same observed data conditions. If two models are fit on different samples, different pre-processing, different time windows, or different population definitions, differences in information criteria may reflect data differences rather than model quality differences. The exam often uses this as a subtle integrity test because learners sometimes accept comparison numbers without checking whether the setup is consistent. Consistency includes using the same response variable definition, the same feature set universe when appropriate, and the same inclusion criteria, because any of those changes can alter likelihood and parameter interpretation. DataX rewards answers that insist on like-for-like comparisons because that reflects professional evaluation discipline. If you would not compare root mean squared error across different target scales, you should not compare AIC or BIC across different data foundations either. When you check dataset consistency first, you avoid being tricked by comparisons that are not meaningful. When interpreting AIC and BIC, the general rule is to prefer lower scores, but you must still confirm that assumptions hold and that the model is appropriate for the scenario. A lower AIC or BIC suggests a better balance between fit and complexity, but it does not guarantee that the model is well specified, that residual behavior is acceptable, or that the model meets operational constraints. The exam may present a situation where a model wins on AIC but violates a key assumption, such as independence or distribution behavior, and the correct answer should not blindly pick the lowest number. This is the same auditor mindset you used in regression evaluation, where you treat metrics as evidence rather than as verdicts. DataX rewards the learner who recognizes that model selection criteria operate within a framework and that the framework's assumptions matter. When you see the phrase, "confirm assumptions still hold," think of it as a reminder that selection metrics do not replace model diagnostics. A model that is parsimonious but wrong is still wrong, and the exam expects you to keep that possibility in view. Small differences in AIC or BIC may not justify switching models, especially when switching carries operational cost or governance risk. The exam often tests whether you can resist unnecessary change, because changing models can require retraining pipelines, updating documentation, revalidating compliance posture, and retraining stakeholders on interpretation. If the criteria values are close, the improvement in trade-off may be marginal and could be within the noise of the modeling process or the variability of the data. In those cases, the better decision may be to keep the current model and focus on monitoring, stability, and incremental improvements rather than swapping for a slightly different option. This is where professional judgment matters, because the best model is not always the one with the smallest number on a leaderboard. DataX rewards answers that consider whether the improvement is meaningful relative to the cost and risk of change. When you can say that a small score difference is not enough proof to justify switching, you are speaking like someone who has deployed models in real systems. A common exam pattern is choosing simpler models when performance is similar, and information criteria support that choice by formalizing parsimony. If two candidate models perform similarly on the metrics that matter, a simpler model is often preferable because it is easier to interpret, easier to test, and easier to maintain. Simpler models can also be more stable under drift because they rely on fewer relationships that can change over time. Information criteria reward this by penalizing unnecessary parameters, making the simpler model more likely to win when the added complexity does not deliver real fit improvement. The exam may frame this as model selection under constraints, where reliability and explainability matter as much as raw performance. Choosing simplicity is not laziness. It is disciplined risk management, especially when the system will be operated, monitored, and audited over time. DataX rewards this because it reflects a mature understanding of lifecycle cost, not just development performance. It is also important not to mix AIC and BIC conclusions without stating preference, because each criterion reflects a different stance on complexity. If you compute both and they disagree, the correct response is not to cherry-pick the one that supports your favorite model, but to decide which stance is appropriate given the scenario's risk tolerance. AIC tends to be less harsh on complexity and may favor models that capture more nuance, while BIC tends to be more conservative and may favor simpler models, especially with larger samples. The exam may ask which criterion to use or may present both values, and the best answer often acknowledges that you must choose a criterion that matches your objectives. This is similar to choosing alpha or selecting precision versus recall, because it is a policy decision about risk and preference. DataX rewards learners who make that decision explicit rather than pretending the criteria are interchangeable. When you state your preference and then interpret consistently, you show disciplined reasoning. Parsimony is not an aesthetic preference. It connects directly to maintainability, interpretability, and deployment risk, which is why the exam cares about it. A model with fewer parameters is often easier to explain to stakeholders, easier to validate, and easier to monitor for drift or unexpected behavior. It can reduce the risk of hidden dependencies where a model relies on subtle patterns that change when upstream systems change. It can also reduce the risk of compliance issues because complex models can be harder to audit and harder to justify when decisions affect customers, finances, or regulated outcomes. Deployment risk includes fragility in production, difficulty in debugging, and higher operational load when performance changes unexpectedly. The exam often frames this through governance language, operational constraints, or stakeholder trust concerns, and parsimony becomes the responsible choice. When you connect parsimony to operational realities, your model selection reasoning becomes more credible and more aligned with DataX expectations. Complexity penalties also tie to business cost and governance concerns because every additional parameter can increase the effort required to manage the model across its lifecycle. Business cost includes engineering time, monitoring overhead, retraining effort, and the cost of mistakes that are harder to detect in complex systems. Governance concerns include documentation, audit readiness, fairness analysis, privacy controls, and stakeholder accountability for model-driven decisions. A more complex model may require more extensive validation and may introduce more avenues for drift and unintended behavior. In some scenarios, complexity may be justified because the decision impact is high and the improvement is meaningful, but the exam expects you to demand proof before accepting that complexity. Information criteria help you formalize that demand by requiring that improved fit outweigh penalty, but you still must interpret the result through operational costs. DataX rewards learners who see that complexity is not just a statistical concept, but a life cycle cost driver. When you tie complexity penalties to governance and cost, you are answering the deeper question the exam is often asking. A useful anchor for this episode is that better fit helps, but extra parameters demand proof, because it keeps your reasoning honest and disciplined. Better fit is valuable because it suggests the model captures real structure, but fit can be misleading when it is achieved through unnecessary flexibility. Extra parameters increase complexity, and complexity increases the chance of overfitting, fragility, and operational burden, so they should only be accepted when they deliver meaningful, validated improvement. This anchor also prevents metric worship because it reminds you that a slightly better number is not the same as a better decision. Under exam pressure, the anchor gives you a clean way to justify parsimony without sounding vague. You are not choosing simpler because you like simple. You are choosing simpler because complexity has costs and must earn its place. Information criteria are one tool that encodes that philosophy into a measurable comparison. When you apply the anchor, you will choose answers that reflect professional prudence and life cycle awareness. To conclude episode 16, select one criterion and then justify it aloud, because the exam is often testing whether you can make a coherent, defensible choice rather than merely recognizing names. If the scenario values capturing nuance and you are willing to accept some complexity when it improves fit, you might justify using AIC as the selection tool within a likelihood-based framework. If the scenario emphasizes strong conservatism about complexity, especially with large samples and high governance stakes, you might justify using BIC because it penalizes extra parameters more strongly. In either case, you should state that models must be compared on the same dataset and that lower scores are generally preferred, while still confirming that assumptions hold and that the improvement is meaningful enough to justify any operational change. Then tie your choice back to maintainability, interpretability, and deployment risk, because that is how model selection becomes a responsible business decision. When you can speak that reasoning clearly, you will be able to handle DataX model comparison questions without hand-waving and with consistent, exam-ready judgment. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.